May 19th, 1944. The Battle of Monte Cassino. The Italian Campaign. This wasn't just a battle, it was a slaughterhouse. It was the Stalingrad of the Western Front. For 5 months, the Allied armies had thrown themselves against the German Gustav Line, a series of fortifications built into the jagged, freezing peaks of the Apennine Mountains. Through the smoke, the sleet, and the deafening roar of mortar explosions, a British forward observer looked through his binoculars and saw something that made him question his sanity. He saw a figure moving through the artillery barrage. The figure was walking upright on 2 legs. It was carrying a crate of heavy 25-pounder ammunition, a crate that normally takes 2 men to lift effortlessly in its arms. The observer wiped his eyes. He thought the stress of combat had finally snapped his mind. He looked again. The soldier wasn't wearing a helmet. He wasn't wearing boots, and he was covered in thick brown fur. It was a 500-pound Syrian Brown Bear. He wasn't running away. He wasn't panicking. He was calmly delivering high explosives to the front line because his friends were tired and he wanted to help. This is not a myth. This is not a Disney movie. This is the true story of Private Wojtek, an officially enlisted soldier, a beer-drinking, cigarette-eating bear who fought the Nazis in Italy. But the story of Wojtek is not just a funny anecdote about a bear. It is a tragedy, an epic, and a testament to the human spirit. To understand how a wild animal ended up with a rank, a serial number, and a job in the artillery, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to a frozen hell in Siberia and an army of orphans who had lost everything. To understand the bear, you must first understand the men who raised him. They were the soldiers of the Polish Second Corps, but in 1940 they were known by a different name, the deportees. In September 1939, Poland was erased from the map. It was the victim of a secret deal between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. The Nazis invaded from the west, and 17 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. The Polish army was crushed between 2 empires. What followed was a campaign of terror. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, rounded up hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens. They didn't just take soldiers, they took doctors, lawyers, professors, farmers, women, and children. Anyone who represented the Polish identity was arrested. They were packed into cattle cars, 80 people to a wagon, with no food, no water, and a hole in the floor for a toilet. They traveled for weeks deep into the heart of Russia. Their destination was the gulags of Siberia. For 2 years, these people lived in an icy hell. They were forced to work in timber camps and mines in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees. They were given 400 grams of bread a day. They watched their children die of typhus. They watched their parents die of starvation. They were stripped of their names, their homes, and their humanity. They were ghosts waiting to die in the snow. But in June 1941, the world turned upside down. Adolf Hitler betrayed his ally. Operation Barbarossa began. 3 million German soldiers smashed into the Soviet Union. Stalin was desperate. He needed every man he could get. He needed allies. In London, the Polish government in exile signed a treaty with Russia. It was a deal with the devil, but it was their only hope. Stalin agreed to amnesty the Polish prisoners. He opened the gates of the gulags. Hundreds of thousands of skeletons walked out of the camps. They began a mass migration south, walking thousands of miles toward the nearest British territory, which was Persia, modern-day Iran. They were led by General Władysław Anders, a man who had emerged from a torture cell in Moscow to lead his people. This Anders army was a ragtag collection of starving survivors. They had no uniforms, no boots, and no weapons. They were ridden with lice and disease, but they had one thing: a burning desire for revenge. They crossed the Caspian Sea and arrived in the port of Pahlavi. For the first time in 2 years, they were safe. They were fed. They were given medical care. But their souls were scarred. They had seen the worst of humanity. They were hardened, cynical, and lonely. They needed something to bring them back to life. It was April 8th, 1942. The Polish Second Corps was moving through the dusty mountainous roads of Hamadan, Iran, heading toward Palestine to link up with the British Eighth Army. A convoy of trucks from the 22nd Artillery Supply Company stopped for a break. These men were the logistics backbone of the army. They were tough, practical men who drove trucks and loaded heavy cargo. While they stretched their legs, they saw a young Kurdish boy standing by the side of the road. He was dragging a large, shapeless jute sack. The sack was moving. It was whimpering. Intrigued, a group of soldiers approached the boy. "What do you have there?" they asked. The boy opened the sack. Inside was a tiny, trembling ball of brown fur. It was a Syrian Brown Bear cub, no larger than a puppy. The boy explained that hunters had shot the mother bear in a cave nearby. He had found the cub alone, starving and crying. The boy wanted to keep him, but he couldn't afford to feed him. The bear was going to die. The soldiers looked at this cub. It was a pathetic sight. He was malnourished, his ribs were showing, and he was terrified of the noise of the trucks. In that moment, the hardened veterans of the Siberian gulags didn't see a wild animal. They saw a refugee. They saw an orphan who had lost his mother to violence. They saw a creature that was hungry, homeless, and lost in a hostile world, just like them. They made a decision instantly. They had to save him. The soldiers pooled their resources. They didn't have money, but they had rations. They offered the boy a few tins of corned beef, a handful of Persian coins, and a massive bar of chocolate. The boy accepted the trade. The soldiers took the cub into their truck. They held him close. One soldier, 18-year-old Irina Bokiewicz, a civilian refugee traveling with the army, named him. She called him Wojtek. In Polish, Woj comes from wojownik, warrior, and Czech comes from uciecha, joy. The name meant joyful warrior, or he who enjoys war. It was a hopeful name for a dying cub, but history would prove it to be accurate. The first few weeks were a struggle for survival. Wojtek was too young to chew solid food. He was suffering from malnutrition. He would cry at night, searching for his mother. The soldiers of the 22nd Company transformed into nursemaids. They improvised a baby bottle using an empty vodka bottle. They filled it with condensed milk diluted with water and twisted a rag into the top to act as a teat. They took shifts feeding him around the clock. They swaddled him in their greatcoats. They let him sleep in their tents, curled up next to them for warmth. Slowly, the cub began to recover. He gained weight. His fur grew thick and shiny. He started to explore the camp. As Wojtek grew, a unique psychological bond formed. Because he had been taken from his mother so young, he imprinted on the humans. He didn't know he was a bear. He looked around and saw two-legged creatures in khaki uniforms, so he assumed he was a two-legged creature in a khaki uniform. He began to copy them. When the soldiers marched in the morning, Wojtek would stand on his hind legs and try to march beside them. When they sat around the campfire, he would sit on a log. When they rode in the trucks, he refused to ride in the back. He wanted to sit in the passenger seat of the cab, hanging his head out the window like a dog. He developed a taste for soldiers' rations. He loved marmalade, honey, and syrup, but he also developed the vices of a soldier. One hot afternoon, a soldier was drinking a bottle of beer. Wojtek nudged him. The soldier poured a little bit into a bowl. Wojtek lapped it up, loved it, and immediately looked for more. From that day on, beer was his favorite reward. He could drink a whole bottle in one go, holding it in his paws like a human. Then came the cigarettes. The soldiers smoked constantly to deal with the stress. Wojtek wanted to participate. A soldier would light a cigarette and hand it to him. Wojtek would take a puff,
inhale the smoke, hold it, and blow it out. But then he would eat it. He would chew up the burning tobacco and swallow it. If you handed him an unlit cigarette, he would spit it out. He only wanted the lit ones. It sounds irresponsible to us today, but you have to remember the context. These men were in the middle of the deadliest war in history. They were miles from home. They didn't know if they would live to see tomorrow. Wojtek was their joy. He was the one thing that made them laugh. His favorite game was wrestling. By the time the army moved to Palestine, Wojtek weighed 200 pounds. He was getting strong. He would approach a soldier and tap him on the shoulder. The soldier would turn around and the bear would grapple him. It looked terrifying to outsiders, a bear mauling a soldier, but it was play. Wojtek was incredibly gentle. He never used his claws. He never bit hard. He would roll the soldiers over, pin them down, and wait for them to tickle his belly. If he accidentally hurt someone, he would whimper and cover his eyes with his paws, begging for forgiveness. He wasn't a pet. He was a brother.
There is a famous story from the unit's time in Palestine that proved Wojtek was more than just a mascot. He was an asset. The Polish Second Corps was stationed in a camp near the desert. There was a serious problem with local raiders and spies stealing weapons and ammunition from the Allied dumps. Wojtek loved water. In the desert heat, he was miserable. Whenever he could, he would try to sneak into the shower block. He learned how to turn the taps on with his paws. The quartermaster hated this because water was rationed, so the door to the bathhouse was usually locked. One night, the door was left unlocked. Wojtek smelled the water. He lumbered inside, hoping for a secret midnight shower. Inside the dark bathhouse, hiding in the corner, was an infiltrator. He was an agent sent to steal rifles and maps. He was waiting for the camp to go to sleep. Suddenly, the door opened. A massive, heavy-breathing shape filled the doorway. The spy froze. Wojtek sniffed the air. He smelled a stranger. He let out a low growl and stepped forward. The spy panicked. He began to scream. He dropped his knife and cowered in the corner, begging for mercy from the demon that had just entered the room. The Polish military police rushed to the scene, weapons drawn. They found the terrified spy surrendering to a confused bear. Wojtek was a hero. The capture of the spy revealed the location of a larger raiding party. The general was impressed. As a reward, Wojtek was given 2 bottles of beer and allowed an unlimited morning in the shower. By 1943, the training was over. The Anders army was ready to join the fight in Europe. Their destination was Italy. This presented a massive logistical and legal problem. To get to Italy, the Polish troops had to board British transport ships, specifically the MS Batory, to cross the Mediterranean. The British Royal Navy had strict regulations, no animals allowed on board. The British portmaster was adamant. "We are transporting soldiers, not a circus," he said. "The bear stays in Egypt." The Polish soldiers were devastated. They held an emergency meeting. They knew what would happen if they left Wojtek behind. He would be put in a zoo in Cairo, or worse, put down. To them, leaving Wojtek was like leaving a wounded comrade. It was dishonorable. So they came up with a loophole. If the British rules said no animals, they would simply stop Wojtek from being an animal. They marched to the recruitment office in Cairo. They sat down with the typewriters. They drafted official enlistment papers. Name, Wojtek. Rank, private. Unit, 22nd Artillery Supply Company. Serial number, assigned. Paybook, issued. His pay was listed in food rations. They presented the paperwork to the British embarkation officer. The officer looked at the manifest. "Private Wojtek?" "Yes, sir." "He's a bear." "No, sir. He is a private in the Polish army. Here is his paybook. Here is his serial number. He is on the roster." The British officer looked at the paperwork.
He looked at the 400-pound bear standing in line with the men, quietly waiting his turn. He looked at the faces of the Polish soldiers, desperate, unyielding. Maybe he had a sense of humor, or maybe he just realized that you don't argue with men who survived Siberia. He stamped the papers. Private Wojtek walked up the gangway. He saluted the officer. Yes, he had learned to salute. He was officially a soldier. Italy was a nightmare. The Allies were fighting their way up the boot of Italy, but they had hit a wall south of Rome. The Germans had constructed the Gustav Line. It was a defensive masterpiece. They had blown up bridges, flooded valleys, and turned every mountain peak into a fortress. The key to the entire line was Monte Cassino. It was a 6th-century monastery sitting on top of a 1,700-foot vertical cliff. It dominated the valley. Whoever held the monastery could see every movement for miles. The Germans had turned the slopes into a kill zone. For months, the Allies tried to take it. The Americans tried in January. They were massacred. The New Zealanders and Indians tried in February. They were massacred. The Allies bombed the monastery into rubble, thinking it would help. It only made it worse. The German paratroopers, the Green Devils, hid in the rubble and became even harder to kill. In May 1944, the job was given to the Polish Second Corps. It was a suicide mission. The terrain was impassable. The roads were just mule tracks. Vehicles couldn't get up the mountain. Every bullet, every bandage, and every artillery shell had to be carried by hand up steep, rocky cliffs under constant sniper and mortar fire. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company was responsible for feeding the guns. The Poles had brought massive British 25-pounder howitzers. These guns were vital. They had to fire non-stop to suppress the Berman bunkers so the Polish infantry could climb the hill. The battle began on May 11th. It was hell on earth. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of explosions that shattered eardrums. The air was thick with gray smoke and the smell of sulfur. The men of the 22nd Company were pushed to the brink of collapse. They were running supplies 24 hours a day. They were sleep-deprived. Their hands were bleeding. Their backs were giving out. The trucks would drive the heavy crates of ammo to the base of the forward positions, but the crates had to be manually unloaded and carried to the gun pits. Each crate weighed over 100 pounds. It contained 4 heavy artillery shells. It took 2 strong men to lift one crate comfortably. The line was faltering. The guns were hungry. Wojtek was there. For his safety, the soldiers had chained him up near the truck park, hidden by camouflage nets. He watched the chaos. He saw the explosions. He saw his pack running back and forth, sweating, shouting, falling down. Wojtek did not like to be left out. He was a creature of imitation. He saw what the men were doing, and he wanted to do it too.
He managed to slip his collar, or perhaps a sympathetic soldier released him. He lumbered out of the cover and walked toward the supply trucks. A British staff officer who was observing the Polish lines watched in disbelief. He saw a massive bear walk up to the back of a truck. The Polish soldier in the truck bed froze. He looked down at the bear. Wojtek stood up on his hind legs. He reached out his front paws. He made a sound, a grunt of expectancy. The soldier hesitated. If he dropped a crate of live explosives on a bear, it could detonate. It could kill them all. But Wojtek waited. His eyes were calm. The soldier pushed a 100-pound crate toward the edge. Wojtek grabbed it. He didn't stumble. He didn't drop it. He pulled the crate against his massive chest. He held it securely. He turned around and began to walk. He walked past the stunned officers. He walked through the mortar fire. He walked right up to the artillery emplacement, where the gunners were frantically reloading. He gently placed the crate down. Then he turned around and went back for another one. The soldiers cheered, "Wojtek! Wojtek!" The sight of their bear, their baby from the desert, walking into fire to help them was like an injection of adrenaline. If the bear wasn't afraid, they couldn't be afraid. For days, Wojtek worked as a loader. Accounts vary on exactly how many crates he carried. Some legends say he carried shells all day. Others say he carried a few to help out. But the eyewitness accounts are clear. He carried live ammunition in the heat of battle. He never dropped a single crate. He never panicked. One British soldier asked a Polish gunner, "Why is the bear helping?" The Pole replied, "He is a private. He has to work for his living like the rest of us." With the relentless support of the artillery, the Polish infantry clawed their way up the bloody slopes. They took heavy casualties, but they didn't stop. On the morning of May 18, 1944, the firing stopped. A patrol of the 12th Podolian Uhlans Regiment climbed over the ruins of the monastery. They found the Germans had retreated. They raised the Polish flag over the ruins. Then, out of respect for their British allies, they raised the Union Jack beside it. They had taken the fortress. The road to Rome was open. The orphans of Siberia had defeated the elite paratroopers of the Third Reich. And amidst the celebration, sitting on an empty ammo crate, eating a celebratory cigarette, was Private Wojtek. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company petitioned the High Command. They wanted to change their official unit insignia. They received permission. The new badge did not feature a cannon or a truck or a bomb. It featured a drawing of a bear walking on two legs, carrying an artillery shell. Wojtek survived the war. He survived the battles of Ancona and Bologna. But the end of the war did not bring a happy ending for the Polish soldiers. In 1945, the war ended, but Poland was not free. At the Yalta Conference, the Western Allies, Churchill and Roosevelt, agreed to leave Poland under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. The Communists took over Warsaw. The soldiers of the Anders Army were branded as traitors and capitalist lackeys by the new Soviet-backed government. If they returned to Poland, they faced imprisonment, torture, or execution. The very people who had fought so hard for their country were now exiles. The Polish Second Corps was transported to Scotland to be demobilized. Wojtek went with them. He lived in Winfield Camp in Berwickshire. He became a massive local celebrity. The Scottish villagers loved him. He attended dances, he played soccer with the soldiers, he was the main attraction at village fetes. But in 1947, the reality set in. The army was disbanded. The soldiers had to leave the barracks. They had to find jobs in factories and farms. They had to move into small apartments in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and London. They couldn't take a 600-pound bear with them. It was the hardest decision of their lives. The officers held a meeting. They decided that the best place for Wojtek was the Edinburgh Zoo. The day they said goodbye was the saddest day in the history of the unit. These were men who had survived the gulags. They had stormed Monte Cassino. They had seen their friends blown to pieces and hadn't shed a tear. But as they watched Wojtek being loaded into the transport truck to go to the zoo, they wept openly. They hugged his neck. They promised they wouldn't forget him. Wojtek arrived at the Edinburgh Zoo. He was given a large enclosure. He became the most famous animal in Scotland. He was on TV, Blue Peter. He had thousands of visitors. But he was sad. Keepers reported that he would pace back and forth. He would sit for hours staring at the wall. He was a soldier who had been put in prison. But the soldiers kept their promise. For the next 15 years, Polish veterans would visit the zoo. They wouldn't come as tourists. They would come as brothers. They would walk up to the enclosure. The bear would be sleeping in the back. The soldier would call out in Polish, "Wojtek, chodź tu," and the bear's ears would twitch. He recognized the language. He recognized the tone. He would lumber over to the fence and sit on his hind legs. The soldiers would talk to him about the old days. They would toss him cigarettes against the rules. Sometimes a veteran would jump over the fence and into the bear pit. The British visitors would scream in terror, thinking the man was about to be mauled. But Wojtek would just tackle the man and wrestle him, licking his face, rolling around in the grass just like they did in the desert in 1942. Wojtek lived until December 1963. He died at the age of 21. His death was headline news. Statues were built in his honor in Krakow, in London, in Edinburgh, and in Cassino.
The story of Wojtek is often told as a funny history fact. A bear who drank beer, a bear who carried ammo. But it is much more than that. It is a story about humanity. War strips away everything that makes us human. It takes our safety, our empathy, and our innocence. The men of the Polish Second Corps had every reason to become monsters. They had been treated like animals by the Soviets. They had been betrayed by the West. But by saving a helpless animal in the desert, they saved themselves. Wojtek was the vessel of their love. He was the proof that they were still capable of kindness. He was their child, their brother, and their comrade. He didn't just carry artillery shells up the mountain at Monte Cassino. He carried the heavy hearts of 40,000 exiled men. So the next time you think a task is impossible, or the next time you think you are too tired to go on, remember the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. Remember the orphans of Siberia. And remember Private Wojtek, the bear who didn't know he was a bear, the soldier who never held a rifle, the hero who just wanted to help his friends. If you enjoyed this incredible true story, please hit the like button and subscribe. We cover the most insane, forgotten moments of history every week. And let me know in the comments, if you were in that British office, would you have stamped the bear's enlistment papers? I'll see you in the next one.